Welcome everyone to the San Diego chapter of Papers We Love for our August meetup. Our presentation this evening is from Andrew Carroll, who's going to present on the paper A Neural Algorithm of Artistic Style by Leone Gatys, Alexander S. Ecker, and Matthias Bethge. Let's have a warm welcome for Andy.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for coming and joining us tonight. I will not be the local expert in the room, given that some people have been, working up their machine learning background recently. But if you have and you've gone through Andrew Ng's Coursera course, you may have seen some of this material before. But when I saw it, I just thought it was, the only word I could think of was cute, super cute. And so I started sort of thinking about it a lot, and then eventually at DePaul, where I'm a faculty member in Chicago, I gave this talk to a group of students, and I thought this is pretty fun, and it lets me look at all these cool pictures. And so tonight I just want to give you an idea of what this neural style transfer thing is, and how it's achieved, and why I think it's so cute. And so as a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm a math professor, but I have tried to hide as much of the mathematics as possible. And I also am not going to explicitly define a neural network tonight. Because really the interesting stuff that's going on in this article is more about how you encode the style of an of an image, how you can actually think about what is the style of an image versus the content of an image. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about image processing and feature extraction from images for a longer part of the talk. And then toward the end, I'll tell you the cool machine learning, deep learning portion. But I'm happy to stay after and talk about what is a neural network. So a little bit of an outline. I'm going to tell you what's the deal, what are we trying to do, and then we're going to go and think about convolutions and filters that can be applied to images, and then how we can layer them to get deeper meaning from images. And then I'll give you the quick spiel on neural networks, and how we can train one to produce what we want it to produce. And then I'm going to tell you some other applications that people have pursued in this direction. So what's the story? What are we trying to do? You have two images. One image we call a content image, and one image we call a pastiche. The content image is an image that we want to essentially get close to replicating, but we want to manipulate it in such a way that it doesn't look exactly like it used to look, so that its style now reflects the style of the pastiche image that we feed it. So one of the classics that I really love here is Doge as Van Gogh, right, as Starry Night. So you take a picture of Doge, famous from the internet and having his own Bitcoin thing. And you want to stylize that picture to look more like this famous Van Gogh. And sure enough, witness over here that the result is not an overlay. It's not that we took like a sum of the two images and divided by 2, right? There's somehow this original image has had some manipulations so that stylistically it's more reminiscent of the pastiche image. So, and I think that's pretty cool. You'll notice that there are sort of brush strokes that happen in the newly created image that only happen in the Van Gogh. They don't happen in the original picture because there aren't brush strokes. And so the question is, how does this happen? How can we build this new image? All right. So that's the motivating picture. Here's some more. This is taken directly from the paper. This is a series of homes in a town in Germany, restylized in the style of a bunch of different artists. And so you can notice a few things. So this is the original image up here, and then the lower left-hand thumbnail is the image after which it's being stylized. And so you can notice that when we sort of stylize it as the Van Gogh, you lose a lot of the straight lines, right? The Van Gogh painting doesn't have straight lines. It has more sort of wavy lines. You can notice that there's overall you get like a color change, right? You get color adaptation that's similar to the the style image. So this has become much more gray and beige. And so how does that happen? How do we get an algorithm to do that for us? To get there, we'll talk about basics of sort of image processing and feature extraction. You may have seen some of these if you're an avid user of Photoshop. So, so what I have here is a picture of the Black Panther poster, and I've applied some filtered transformations to this image. So in this second cell here, I've blurred the image. In the third, you see that what's being emphasized are the edges, are the hard edges, whereas the portions of the original image where there's not a lot of difference in color, where there aren't strict edges, those tend to be sort of grayed out. And here, it may look like it's the same, but it's not quite. In this image, you'll notice that it's sort of the vertical edges have become dark or light, and in this one, it's horizontal edges that have become dark or light. And so it's a different filter that's being applied, but very similar. It's just a rotation of it. This second to last one here is like an embossing. You know, if you wanted to emboss an image, that's a type of filter that you could apply. And this one is a more complicated sort of measuring gradation across the different color channels. Okay, so I want to talk about a little bit of the mathematics behind what produced these images. So first, just some terminology. So a filter, which is also known as a kernel in the literature, it's just a rectangular array of numbers that you can compare in a way that I'm going to define in a moment to an image array in patches. So our images are going to be stored as an array of numbers, usually pixel intensities between 0 and 255. And if I take a filter, so in this case I've chosen a 3x3 filter, it's just a 3x3 array of numbers. And if I also have a 3x3 patch of an image, so some little sub-piece of an image, the convolution of those two is simply defined essentially as doing a dot product of the flattened matrices. So you multiply component-wise, and then you sum up the results. It's the thing that always annoys me in NumPy in Python, right? That multiplication to me should just be matrix multiplication, but actually in NumPy it's entry by entry multiplication. You have to tell it explicitly that you want it to do matrix. But this is entry by entry and then take the sum. Okay, but so maybe our filters are small, but most images are more than 3x3 arrays, right? They're large arrays, and so what do we do with that? Oh, so just a little bracket thing. This is not actually the real definition of convolution in mathematics. There's a transpose that should be thrown in, but we don't care. So don't take me literally. I should mention there are a number of times in this this talk that I will lie to you. This is the first one, but I'm going to tell you where I'm lying. And then what we can do is look at the entire image and break it up into pieces, 3x3 pieces in this case, and pass the filter over each of those pieces and do this calculation. So, a little animated GIF here from Theano documentation. So here's a 3x3 filter. It's passed over, the first thing it does is it's passed over the top left 3x3 patch of the image, and the result is a single number that we store. And then we slide it over to the next 3x3 patch. We apply this convolution operation, and we get a single number, and so on. Okay, so this part is foundational. This part is really important. So if you have a question about that before I move on, feel free to jump in. Okay, just as a bit of nomenclature, the output when you pass a filter over an entire image is often called a feature map for a reason that I'm going to make clear in a moment. So what I have here in black, these are the entries in the array for an image. Can you tell what this patch of this image might look like? Yeah, so it's a harsh vertical line, right? So I'm pretty sure if it was all 225s, that would be very bright, and then 0 is very dark. And so you have a dark to light vertical line. So I'm going to pass the filter that has all 1/9ths in it over this image. So I just put the 3x3 filter over this patch here. What I'm going to do is multiply each of these numbers by 1/9 and add the result. That is 0, and just as a convention, I'm going to place it at the middle of where that filter multiplication happened. Okay, and then I'm going to move it to the right. 1/9 times 0, 1/9 times 0, and so on. Sum it up, you get 0. Okay, this seems a little bit boring. But now what's going to happen? We're going to get 1/9 times all these zeros, but also 1/9 times 225, 1/9 times 225, 1/9 times 225, and add those up. So if you're understanding the convolution operation correctly, you're probably seeing that all I'm really doing is averaging the 9 cells, the 9 pixel values that are around the central pixel. So you take an average. Okay, here I'm taking an average, here I'm taking an average, and so on. But you can see now that I'm in this very bright field, it's just going to be 225s. Yes? So the original input. So everything is done on the original input. That's could be. So you don't update.
It shows 75 there. Is that an artifact, or is it considering that an input to forward? So that's the output of that operation.
Yes.
And then the next one that shows 75. Is that the input to that operation?
No. I should make this more clear. But we maintain the only quantities we're using are the black entries, sort of the pre-convolution array, and then these are the pieces of data that I'm storing afterward. So I'm not gonna use those in sort of a recurrent manner.
2 layers here we're viewing.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, and then we move up, we keep doing it, and we would continue in the same fashion. Now, what has happened to this harsh vertical edge after convolution? So when we had all zeros and then all 255s, it was a very stark vertical edge. And now it goes from 0 to 75, then 150, then 225. So what might that image now look like? It's like slightly smoothed, right? It's blurred. And in fact, that's exactly how I created this image, was to pass this filter over the original Black Panther poster. We could then ask, what about this guy? So this filter, it sees a 3x3 patch. All it does is it takes the top pixel value and subtracts off the bottom pixel value. So when will that quantity be large? I guess it'll be large if the top pixel value differs significantly from the bottom pixel value, which is what you'd see at a horizontal edge. And indeed, by passing that filter over this image, it produces this sort of horizontal edge detector. One interesting note here, so you'll see, for example, the quantity is going to be positive if you had a large intensity and a low intensity, so going white above dark is going to be a very positive number with this, and doing dark above light is going to be a very negative number. So after scaling appropriately, that's why you're getting, in this case, very dark horizontal lines that are emphasized, and in this case, very light horizontal lines that are emphasized. So there's a directionality to it. Yes?
What are you considering a pixel value? Typically pixels, right, is like an RGB or...
Yes, good question. So for right now, and for the next 2 minutes, allow me to only think of grayscale images. Okay. So that really the pixel intensity is how much light is there. But very shortly, I'll talk about the fact that you have multiple channels.
So does the middle one run on a grayscale? Because right, the one on the left can't be grayscale, or are you operating just on one?
I actually threw this filter over each of the channels.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but that's a very good question. I will. Yeah, and I guess similarly here, I ran this same filter over each of the channels. Okay, and then this third one, what's it going to do? It's going to take the central pixel, multiply it by 1, and return that. So nothing, right? Returns the same image. So that's the identity filter. But I want you to sort of change the way that you're thinking about these, even though I've made these nice pictures by hand. So instead of thinking about how it's going to manipulate the image, what you might want to think about is what pieces of the image are going to spit out very large numbers when this filter is passed over them, or that filter, and which patches are going to spit out very low numbers. And so I've put those so-called activations here. So this is going to be spit out a very large number if it's passing over a large patch of white, right? So when the blur filter passes over this portion of the image, it's going to spit out high numbers. When it passes over this portion of the image, it's going to spit out low numbers. This filter is going to spit out very large numbers when, I think we said, when you have a light pixel above a darker pixel. And so when it sees a horizontal line, it's going to spit out a large positive number, or if it's a dark to light, it'll spit out a large negative number. And then here, this is going to highly activate, spit out a large number, when you have a very bright pixel at some location. Okay, so here are some of the hidden details. Like I said, I am lying to you. It's not true that images are rank 2 arrays. They're actually rank 3 arrays. I know it's maybe more common to call it dimension 3, but that's not quite right. It's rank 3 because they're rank 3 tensors, if you're interested. But so color images are rank 3 arrays. You have 3 so-called color channels, red, green, and blue. So each image is stored as height times width times 3 so-called volume or array. So what a filter is not actually a 2 by 2 object that's passing over a 2 by 2, or excuse me, it's not a rank 2 object, it's actually a rank 3 object, which also has depth. So instead of a 3 by 3 filter, we'd have a 3 by 3 by 3 filter. So 27 numbers that we're passing over the image. And this gives us a lot more control as to what we're measuring, right? If I had a filter that had a lot of ones in the front channel and all zeros in the second and third channel, then if I pass that over something that's red, it will be very highly activated. Okay, so it can pull out things about color, but it can also measure things across the channels. Okay, this is just also a slight lie that I made, which is that the result of what you're doing when you do this passing a filter over an image array, it's not necessarily going to produce a pixel intensity that's reasonable, right? A number between 0 and 255. So I just reprocessed the image to sort of scale things so that you could visualize it. But we're actually okay with the results not being in that interval. There is like a sort of downsampling that occurred, that we changed the size of the image by a little bit because when you pass a 3 by 3 over a 3 by 3 patch, you've collapsed it to a single number. But you can, if you want to counteract that, if you're interested in counteracting that, you can do so by what's called zero padding, which is just to put a bunch of zeros on the outside of the image in such a way that the collapsing actually recollapses you to the original image size. So if you're interested, that's possible.
A quick question.
Yes.
So single zero padding is enough, given that we have 3 by 3 matrix?
So in that specific case, single pad was enough. In that I'm going to slightly address that in the next bullet point here, which is there's another parameter we can apply that's called stride, which is how much of a jump do we want to make. So instead of, I don't know why my favorites bar keeps coming up. So instead of passing 1 step by 1 step, you can pass 2 steps at a time. So these are parameters that you have control over. Yes?
Just to be clear, you've got an F by F by 3 filter, you're still only sliding it left and right, you're not somehow going deep.
That's right.
In color.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, and so so the filter size, the padding, and the stride all go into determining the output shape of the array. Yeah, Marvin.
But the other thing to note about the padding is when you do that, there's going to be a visual artifact because you're adding
Yes.
now 0 pixels to the average. or at least to one side of the filter. However,
Yeah.
if you were doing the averaging filter, now you would have a bunch of 0 pixels dragging the average down. So that's going to result in a fade to black at the edge of the image.
Yes.
So do you mean that padding can actually affect the image? Because as I understood, we use padding just so that edge pixels don't get deprived or kind of under-processed by the filter, and because we want it to end up at GPU, we want it uniform. So that's why we add padding, and then it is straightforward. Apply filter, and that padding just does nothing. We do it just for the edges.
Yeah. So it sort of all depends on the shape of the output that you would like. For the purpose of this talk, the authors in this paper use a network where there is padding applied to maintain shape for a few layers at a time. And so, but yeah, it is zero padding, so you do get edge effects.
It need not be zero padding on the canvas.
That's right, and you can do other types of padding. So I was just doing the simplification here, but you can do other types of padding. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
one last thing. So if it was just zero padding, there would be a black 1 pixel line outside the edge.
That is being, and then we're passing a filter over it, right? And so yes, that's the case, but then we're using that just to pass the filter over and apply the convolution. Yeah.
I think in like the more general case with convolutional neural nets, like very quickly you stop thinking about these things as images.
Yes.
Like you said, like they stop, the values that it spits out are no longer pixel values. Like you're really throwing it into the neural net soup and you're getting out values, and like they have ways to interpret what it is activated by at different points, but it's like it's not really an image anymore.
Yeah.
Like
So that's
it's very much an image.
right. Yeah. So that's where I was saying on the previous page. You think more about what large numbers and small numbers are going to be spit out by the filter passing over, rather than thinking about the image that it will construct. But it is the case that if you zero pad, you will create some edges that didn't exist previously. So you'll have some bright activation of a vertical edge feature detection. Yeah.
So if it's, I like that point very much. It's sort of a very abstract. It goes from an image to something abstract, much more abstract. What meaning, whatever meaning means, is the thing that is output.
So I think we will somewhat get there. we will approach an answer to that, but not something that might be human interpretable. So, okay. So how then should we measure style? What is style? What does that even mean? So that's really, in my mind, the contribution that Gatys and the team brought to the table here is actually from a previous paper that they wrote, but then they applied it to this neural style transfer. So how can we use these filters to measure style? Well, first, we cook up a bunch of filters: vertical edge detector filter, a horizontal edge detector filter, a blue color filter, a yellow color filter, a filter that measures whether there's like a gradation between red and blue in this one patch in a patch. And so you can construct those filters by hand if you wanted to, and you can pass each of them over the image. And so if you had C of them, if you had 100 of them, the output would be 100 new arrays. Oops. And at each location in the original image, what we'll have is essentially the activation of each of the filters that we picked out at that location. And that value is what I call A sub I at xy. So xy is the location, I is which filter we threw at it. So it could be the vertical edge filter, how strongly activated is it at the location xy. And we measure that for each of the locations in each of the filters. So it spits out for each location a vector in C-dimensional real space. And so what is style? Well, their proposal is that style is measured by the correlation between filters. Kind of. That's a lie. It's a useful lie, though. So you could ask, is it true that when I see vertical lines, they tend to happen in blurry sections of the image. Is it the case that yellow tends to co-occur with regions that aren't quite straight lines frequently? Is blue just generally really present in the image, right? Like the Van Gogh, blue is very present in that image, and so that's somehow a piece of its style. But there's more, right? There's like in the Van Gogh, there's like the moon, right? And it's not only a moon that has a crescent shape, but also sort of every time you see this big crescent shape in the image, it's yellow. So there's a co-occurrence that's happening. And what they suggest is that that is essentially what's measuring style. So you can actually compute something based on that. It's called the Graham matrix, but this is where it's a lie because it's not actually correlation or covariance. You simply take how activated, so for each pair of filters that you have, you ask how often is this first filter activated at the same time as this second filter. So if vertical, if you have the two filters vertical and blurry that pass over, and if they both happen at the same locations frequently, then this quantity is going to be large. And if they don't co-occur that frequently, this quantity is going to be small. Now, you might say, well, you really should be using covariance. And I think that that's a really interesting point. I think it would be interesting to throw that in as an extra measure. But the one thing that this does help us with is if blue is highly represented, the entry in the matrix that you would get by calculating covariance would be essentially measuring like how much fluctuation in blue there is. But that's not really what we want. We want to measure, I want to say, if I want the entry of this matrix corresponding to blue filter paired with blue filter, I want it to be very large if there's a lot of blue. So I don't want it to be really the variance. I want it to be, I want it to get some power by how strictly frequently it occurs, some frequency. Yes?
So an example of what would produce a Graham matrix that was an entry in a Graham matrix where you'd have strong correlation would be say you have someone painting blue lines, and if you had, say, there were blue vertical lines, then the vertical edge detector would be activated at the same time as the blue filter.
Absolutely.
And that would produce a large entry in the Graham matrix.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, very nice.
I'm sorry, what's a blue filter?
So blue filter would be, so again, we have these filters that are, let's say in our case, 3 by 3 by 3, right? And so if you want a filter that's highly activated when it sees blue, it's RGB, right? So you would want zeros in the front channel, zeros in the second channel, and ones in the last channel. That way, when it sees a lot of blue, it sends out a really large number. When it sees,
so the convolution is applied to all the three channels at the same time.
Yes.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. That's the leap we make when we go into color images.
So what would be for example, the cardinality of the output? We basically have a possible infinite number of filters. So we have an infinite number of images, whatever we call the stuff after images. So, what's the cardinality of the output of
Right.
the image?
So you make a choice at the onset as to how many filters you want to use. And if I only use, in this next example, I'm going to use 3 filters. So then I would get a 3 by 3 matrix out of this. So you have to make a choice. You don't simply use all possible filters.
What would happen if you did?
Well, computationally, I think it would be quite difficult.
Let's say an infinite machine, run it for 100 years.
I mean, there's just like you can make arbitrarily many filters. Like what is that?
Yeah, what it would be.
Right. At some point, many of them will not be measuring novel characteristics.
So it would disappear.
I don't think it would disappear, but you'd get a tremendous amount of redundancy. It would be capped somehow by what's that?
Diminishing returns.
Yeah, right. It would be capped somehow by some function of the size of the input array in the first place.
So these vectors RC is specific to a particular location xy, right? So each location xy has its own vector c.
Yes.
And I wonder, just like you said, what would happen if you were to be more go into somehow you're tied to one location, so you cannot explore dimensionality. Is it possible to maybe see how one location in one of dimensions correlates with another location, another dimension? And then you can do the statistics tools like autocorrelation with some distance and all that. That would be pretty.
Yeah, so I think that would be interesting. And the way that that's sort of tackled in this literature, I think it's on a later page, but is actually using multi-layered networks. So that it's, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Yeah. So to start with, these are very small filters, and it's seeing a very local part of the picture. So you're right to capture that.
Is the activation 3-channel or single channel?
Single value output. So it's like a dot product. It's essentially this 3 by 3 by 3 piece. Match it up with this 3 by 3 by 3 piece, and you spit out a single value. Okay. So I have an example here. These are just some images that I generated, some blinds, with some pieces covered up. And these two images are not exactly the same image, but stylistically they're about right. They're about similar, right? You have like a lot of horizontal stuff going on here. And they seem to be stylistically distinct from what's happening in this image. And indeed, I used 3 different filters: a horizontal edge filter, a vertical edge filter, and a diagonal filter, which you can probably write down a little bit what form you think that might take. And so I used those 3 in that order in this matrix. And so this 0.23 entry is essentially saying that that we do have a large activation of the horizontal filter. But this activation of 0 here in this location is saying that the vertical filter and horizontal filter don't generally pop at the same time. That's what this 0 says. Is that in particular it's because there aren't enough like vertical lines in this picture, right? And so it's saying that we don't have this co-occurrence of horizontal and vertical in this image.
The vertical is just 0 everywhere, right?
I'm sorry?
The vertical is just 0 everywhere.
Well, so that's what I would have thought too, except here, right? They're like. So I think I actually did rounding here, and there is like a very small value, but it's the accuracy is not close enough. So when you compare that to this image, you see that actually the horizontal filter and the vertical filter tend to pop at about the same times, right? Which is about right, because at this diagonal line, your pixel value differs a lot if you move to the right or if you move down. Okay, and of course, like in this one, the diagonal filter pops a lot, pops very strongly. And so you can see, and yeah, it really did turn out this way. These are exactly the same Graham matrices for these 2 images, despite the fact that they are not equal. They are not the same image, but stylistically, they're viewed as equivalent and quite distinct from this image. Okay. So that's the Graham matrix. So we consider, so Graham matrices should be like close to each other, similar matrices, not in the mathematical sense, if the local styles are similar, if you tend to see vertical at the same time as horizontal and so on. And so their notion of the measure of how far apart 2 images are in style is that you look at their Graham matrices for a certain collection of filters, well chosen. You take the difference between those 2 matrices, and then it's called Frobenius norm. Don't worry about it. You're just basically squaring every entry and adding the results. So it's just the Euclidean distance between the 2 matrices if you view them in m times n dimensional space. So that's the idea. Style difference is measured by just seeing, in a Euclidean sense, how close are the 2 Graham matrices. Of course, you'd want to choose good filters to start with, but as, maybe by hand we could engineer quite a few together, right? We could engineer good vertical filters, blue filters, and so on. That's not the goal. Doing it by hand is not the goal.
So
yes?
Would it be fair to say that the collection of filters will help you to find specific stylistic differences?
Yes.
So you want one collection for Van Gogh style images and another collection for like blueprints.
So it is the case that you may want to, that your choice of sort of training data, I'll say, can change the filters that will be generated. So the filters are going to be automatically generated in a way that I'll talk about in a moment. But it is true that if you were to sit down and by hand want to pick out some filters that measured like sort of artistic paintbrush style, then maybe you could think of some clever filters in that domain. They wouldn't be as clever filters in Blueprint, as you mentioned. But again, goal is not to determine them by hand. So I'll talk about how they can be automatically generated. Andrew.
So the size of the gram matrix would be the same size as the convoluted or the activation?
Not quite. So the size of the gram matrix is, if you have C filters, C because it's channels. If you use C filters overall, you will have a C by C matrix. Because the entries of the gram matrix correspond to correlations between pairs of filters, right? Vertical filter paired with horizontal filter is one entry of that matrix. And so the size of the matrix G is number of channels by number of channels, square matrix. Okay. So I'll just point out here, we were using these really small filters. So we were using F by F patches. We were using 3 by 3 actually. And so mostly what this is going to be able to capture is like edge color relationships. That's why I kept saying vertical lines in yellow and so on. So if we want to see something more interesting, a broader pattern, something about like really brush strokes, how they look, we need to go deeper in a sort of formal sense. So what is going deeper? We use convolutional networks. We simply, what we're going to do is apply a sequence of convolutions. So let's just figure out what convolution does. If we start with an height by width by 3 image, right, 3 color channels, and apply C1 filters to it, we'll get an output of a certain size in height and width, but we'll have, since we use C1 filters, we'll have a total of C1 new arrays. Okay. All right, that's great. But what's the difference now between that and the image that we started with? It's a new array, right? It's got height and width and depth. So we could apply convolution again. But the block that we would have to compare it with, it has to be as deep as the number of channels you have, right? We went 3 deep when we had 3 channels. And so you can apply convolution to this newly output array with a new collection of features which have some shape, but they have the same depth as the output of the previous step. So if I have 100 filters that I ran over my original image, the output is going to be 100 new arrays. So if I want to apply convolution to that thing, I have to have filters that have depth 100. I apply that, and it produces new arrays. And then we just keep doing this. So here's a little picture that you can use to kind of help you. This slightly blue spot, so this would be like first layer, second layer, third layer. So this would be the input array, the image, initial image. This would be the output after passing a bunch of filters over. And this is going to be a third layer that we tack on. So this little blue spot sees, if we're using 3 by 3 filters, sees this blue patch of the original image. That's all it sees. But then this red patch at the very end, it sees this 3 by 3 patch in the second layer, which itself saw a much larger region, right? So already in this second layer, third layer, I suppose, this single value has been affected by all of these entries in the original image. This is the notion of a receptive field, which comes from neuroscience, which is that deep down here, you're getting a value which is influenced by a larger and larger patch of the input image. Now, again, I've done a little bit of a lie, right? Which is that these outputs, so I made it kind of fuzzy. They have channels, right? So this was had 3 channels, red, green, and blue. This one's going to have as many channels as the number of filters we used. And so just keep in mind that convolution is with a really big block. I think I had one more picture here. Oh, yeah, so maybe this will help illustrate what's going to happen. So if I had this blue square here, and I passed a horizontal edge detector over it, then it's going to detect this edge, so that's why I put gray here. It's going to see that there's an edge here, and see that there's an edge here. And then on these sides, it's not going to really see a horizontal edge. On the other hand, the vertical edge detector is going to see a vertical edge here and a vertical edge here. So in the next layer, if we wanted to develop something that would see squares, we might want a filter that is going to take its information, maybe we'll put ones at this location, this, and this. So that it adds up the contribution at each of these locations so that it's highly activated when these four things pop. So that's how with even just very small 3x3 patches, you can see we would kind of already be able to see deeper meaning in the image. We can eventually get to a square despite the fact that our small 3x3 filters themselves would not be able to pick up on a square. You have to have more information. Yeah.
So a 3x3 filter will see a 3x3 square in the original image. So you have to run multiple filters of varying sizes to catch different size squares.
So yeah, so actually generally the idea is you want to maintain, or at least in the model that's used in this paper, you want to actually maintain very small filter size and just have faith that later on, when you've applied a number of convolutions, you can see these larger structures. So it is not the case necessarily that with a 3x3 filter we could see a larger square, but deeper in this sequence, we may be able to pick out a square because we've seen a lot of horizontals, a lot of verticals, maybe there'd be a corner and so on. Yes?
So that's, I think the technical term for that is size invariance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And likewise to translation invariance, like
Right.
detect a shape or some other abstraction in the image regardless of its position.
That's right. Yeah, so it's the same filters that are being passed over each spot in the image. So it will be able to recognize a square no matter where in the image it is, which is this location invariance.
And is that size invariance largely a property of running the same filters at multiple layers and each representation being scaled effectively?
Yeah, I mean, so it actually turns out that the size invariance is a little bit more nuanced, and in fact, I don't think that the standard techniques are to manipulate your training data so that it sees a bunch of different scale. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are different ways to do it, but if you're just doing a number of like 3x3 convolutions, for example, you may run into problems with scale invariance, and so it's something that, like I say, that you can manipulate training data so that you make sure that you have different scales represented.
Well, one other question. Conceivably, you could include the color channels and not discard them immediately after
That's
the first
true.
layer if you wanted to. Is that
if it maintains size, right? If it maintained, so if I pass this filter over, remember it could like change the size of the output array,
Mm-hmm.
and ideally we'd like the output, so-called volume, to all be the same shape arrays. So yeah, so you'd have to be careful about that.
Well, if you do that, then you won't be able to catch the color information.
Yeah, well, and I might also just mention that is a filter in and of itself. The identity filter is a filter, so it could happen. That could be a filter that's generated first, if it turns out to be useful. So again, shame on me. I'm lying to you. Because so the lie here is that if you just stack convolutions, I apply convolution to this image and produce a bunch of new arrays, and then apply convolution to that. The result of that two-step process can actually be shortcut by just doing a single convolution. So have I really done anything new? I haven't, but to avoid this degeneracy problem, after the application of convolution, you apply what's called a nonlinearity. There's a big garden of nonlinearities, but you can just think like, okay, maybe what I'll do is with every output value that I get, I'm going to threshold it between 0 and 1. I guess not threshold, but I'm going to interpolate between 0 and 1. So very, very negative values I'm going to set equal to 0. Very positive values I'll set equal to 1. And numbers that are really close to 0, I'll interpolate between 0 and 1. So that's called the sigmoid activation. And shame on you, right? It's shame on you if I lied to you twice. Because this is also a lie. This is not what's used anymore. Certainly not in convolutional neural networks. There's a bunch of so-called activation functions. I won't get into them. Just know that we're applying something so that the output is not quite convolution. It's convolution with a transformation applied so that it's not just degenerate.
Is the purpose to normalize, or is it to add non-linearity?
So it's to add nonlinearity. It's so if you're familiar with I don't know, with matrix algebra, let's say, if you multiply two matrices, let's see what I should say is the result of composing two matrices with one another is itself a matrix, right? Two composed matrix transformations is again a matrix transformation. So why would you encode that transformation as a single matrix multiplication when you could just encode it as a single matrix? So essentially, that's like a redundancy, and we don't want that redundancy, or maybe degeneracy is the right word. So it's not so much about normalization, but if you have concerns about that for getting exceptionally large values and so on, that can be applied. Okay, and so the lingo that I've been using here, just to make it a little bit formal, the entries in these output arrays are called activations. How highly a filter is activated by the piece of the image that it moved over. Okay, so let's visualize this network. This network here was developed by Simonian and Zisserman in 2015 when they were trying to tackle an ImageNet classification problem. So I'll describe that in a moment. So in the first step, they have input images that are 224 by 224 by 3 channels. They pass 64 filters over that image. So the output, and then they apply some padding. So the output is 224 by 224 by 64. They then pass a new set of filters, 64 of them, over that output, and it produces a new output. And then they apply some sort of downsampling that I don't really want to describe, but it's like decreasing resolution, right? You just downsample so that it's a fourth as large as the original, this big block. And then they pass 128 filters over each of these, and then they do a downsampling, and then they pass 256 even more filters over the resulting smaller volume, and so on, and they keep repeating this. Okay, so here's a reasonable question. Did those two authors sit down and just write down each of these filters? No, because that's a lot, right? That would be a whole lot of numbers, right? So 3 times 3 times 64 entries to fill in just for this first layer. But then you have to fill in all of the entries for your filters for this next layer and so on. And so should you ask experts for really good filters? Well, no. Turns out that's where the machine learning comes in. You can build an algorithm that will learn what good filters are. And so I'll describe that in a moment. So figuring out what filters to use, what are the numbers that fill those filters, that parameter learning is performed on a classification task, which is a task where you input an image as an array, and you want the output to be a guess as to what's in that image. Hot dog, not hot dog, right? If you're familiar. So now I can talk about machine learning. Perfect. So what's the goal of classification? The goal would be to find a function from your input space to a set of classes. So my set of classes could be like food items, for example, and the input space would be the set of pictures I can take with my new camera phone, right? So the input, all possible images that could come out of me taking a picture, and I want the output to be what food item is in this picture. But to mathematize that a little bit, you actually don't want just a discrete function like this. You actually want the output to be a vector, where in the vector, you sort of want maybe hot dog is the first entry. If it's 1, then there's a hot dog, and if it's 0, then there's definitely not a hot dog, right? And so this is just a a slight change in point of view, that you want your output to be indicator vectors instead of just strings, for example. Okay, so what are the ingredients if we want to solve this problem? Given that we're not omniscient, right? So the first is a set of so-called training data. So input-output pairs. Input hot dog, output is of class hot dog. Right? Picture together with what class is it. But you need a lot of these. You also have to make an assumption on what the structure of the function is. So this is parametric method, right? We need to say what type of function it is in order to learn the actual structure of the function. Again, if we were omniscient, then we would have seen every picture that could possibly be generated ever. And we would be able to say explicitly every time exactly what the output is. But we're not. And so we settle for accepting that there might be some model that we can use to make these predictions. Yeah?
Would you also need, if you were omniscient and you had seen all those pictures, would you also need an infinite size filter in order to, or an infinite size network?
So I think if you're omniscient, you wouldn't need a network at all. It would simply take in all of the input pixels and be able to tell you, it'd be essentially a discrete function, but it would be able to tell you exactly what the output should be. But that's not the world we're in. So we could make the assumption, for example, that if you give me an input array, I'm going to flatten that array into a vector, multiply it by a matrix, and add a scalar, so a so-called affine transformation, and that's going to be what my function should look like. That's just a guess. But there are other ideas as to what this function could look like. So that's the second thing you need. And the third is an error function. How far off is your answer? So this function that I'm going to develop, I'm going to spit out my guesses as to what each input actually is, and I may be wrong. And I need a way to say how wrong I am. So you could do something like, if the output is a vector and the supposed output was supposed to be a 1 in this location and zeros elsewhere, we could do like Euclidean distance. That's not typically what's done, but you could do something like that. So it's just how far off is my guess from the actual answer. Once you have that input data, you're ready for machine learning. That is, well, at least for classification. So how does it work? We randomly initialize the parameters of the model, which means that in this simple affine linear transformation model, I would initialize what this matrix A is and what this vector B is. So just at random. Fill in the entries. Then for every input image, I would send that image through my model. In other words, I would compute that A times the flattened array plus the bias term, and it's going to output a vector in each case. And that's going to make really bad predictions because I have chosen at random what the entries are. It has no connection to what I'm supposed to be doing. So we can measure how far off you are overall, meaning you will have a bunch of inputs and a bunch of incorrect outputs. And you want to know how far off are those incorrect outputs from what you wanted. And you add up that, you sort of aggregate that error, how far off your answer is. And then you want to change the model parameters to decrease that quantity, how far off you are. And that is, if you ever took my Math 260 class, then you know that that can be done by what's called gradient descent, which I will not go into detail with tonight, but simply say that whenever you have a function of multiple inputs, in this case the entries of that matrix A and the entries of B are inputs to this loss function, to this error. Whenever you have a function of multiple variables, if you want to decrease that function, and the function is differentiable, then you can apply the technique of gradient descent. And it essentially comes down to taking a bunch of partial derivatives and changing your input values, so changing the entries of the matrix A and the vector B as prescribed by that algorithm. So you sort of decrement each of the original values by something having to do with the partial derivative with respect to that variable. So that is that's no details on what gradient descent is, but at the bottom, this is what you do. You take the gradient of the function with respect to those input variables, and you subtract off a multiple of that from the values that you had started with. And you don't have to know that. You just have to know that there exists some technique that allows that to happen. Yes?
There's not a quiz at the end.
That's correct.
Why are you making bad predictions rather than random or other kind of predictions?
Well, probabilistically, I'd say that'd be bad, right? So yeah, because you are making random guesses, and chances are that's going to be pretty rough.
So
Yep.
bad means simply that instead of hot dog, if they were wrong predictions, then you would always say no, that's not a hot dog, but it was.
Yeah, right.
But instead, you're getting a random guess. You're seeing 0.5 everywhere.
Yeah, or depending on the number of classes, right? If you're doing uniform guessing across 1,000 classes, you would be right, 1 in 1,000 times. And the guarantee of this gradient descent is that if you change those parameters as given by gradient descent, then when you redo this experiment, send all your input data through your model, this quantity is going to go down. Maybe not a lot, but it will decrease as long as you update your parameters in a minimal enough way. And so you can keep doing this. You can iterate over and over and over again. And the idea of gradient descent is essentially, if you're standing on a hill and you want to get to the bottom of the hill, always go in the direction where it's steepest downward. That's what this does, and eventually you'll get to a basin, even if it's not the overall lowest value you can get. So this particular network, which eventually spits out a vector in 1,000 dimensional space, was trained by that duo on a big data set, which was a bunch of pictures that had things like porcupines, sloths, marmots, laptops, probably hot dogs. And by applying this gradient descent technique, the algorithm learns, that's what they call it, but really it's just seeking the lowest point for a function. The algorithm learns what good filters or what useful filters can be applied in this sequence of convolutions. So that's where the fact that we're not hand coding these filters. The filters are actually learned by that classification algorithm. Yeah, so I'll just mention they got some really good. I think they won this competition when it came out using very small 3x3 filters. That's why I was using 3x3. Whereas you might think like, okay, you should start with huge filters, right? If you want huge content, but actually small filters, but going deep seems to have worked quite well.
Are you using filter for a classification system? Meaning you're now saying there's filters, but really what it's doing is identifying something to do with it.
Yeah, so what happens in this, what happens when you feed this an image? It applies convolution once, it applies convolution again, it applies a downsampling, applies convolution again and again and over, right? And at the end, there's one extra transformation, which is essentially just flattening the result. So you'll have like this rank 3 array, but you just unspool it to a single vector. And covering up some details, again lying, you get out a 1,000 dimensional vector. So that output is the thing that we're going to say is our guess. So wherever I find like the largest entry in that output, I'm going to guess it's that. Is it the 3-toed sloth gets the largest value? Then I'm going to guess it's a 3-toed sloth.
A question.
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that to improve it, we want those learners to be even more slow? So the concept of slow learners, does it apply here?
So in what sense you?
So like I have. So I have a good intuition about those convolutional layers.
Mm-hmm.
So as opposed to when your vanilla neural network where everything affects everything.
Right.
In this case, we don't want that because
right.
the entire image will like do convolute the output, so we do convolution to again that.
Right.
So essentially, those big layers take it piece by piece and slowly learn what's inside those squares, and then
yes.
we narrow filters, and we have several of them. pretty much to give this neural net a chance to self-correct. And if we want it to self-correct even better, we need more of these guys, and the model will be even larger.
Yeah.
But because we have more of them and maybe throw in some learn rate,
Yes.
they will have a better chance to give us a better result.
Yeah. So I kind of want to chat about that with you, but maybe after, because there's something interesting that I've been thinking about relative to that. So maybe a punt for a moment.
My question in the same direction is, what is the intuition behind the actual structure of the network? I mean, there's a lot of wisdom just in this picture here. How did they come up with that?
Right. Okay. So I might be a little bit lying, but well, this has 64 channels. We're gonna sort of cut the size in half, so we're gonna double the number of channels, and then we're gonna cut the size in half again and double the number of channels. I think a lot of this is sort of play around and see if you can produce something that gets good results, right? So it's
there's a lot of chance to make. I mean,
sure.
Infinite field, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But there is.
There needs to be some intuition that's right.
Yeah, and
Well, the
you could probably go ahead.
Sorry. I was saying that the convolution has intuition. It's trying to capture the details inside
Yeah.
the picture.
Yeah.
But how it should be laid out,
Yeah.
it could be random. It could be random.
Why
Sometimes
7
Sure.
levels? Why
Yeah.
not 16 levels?
it depends
Yeah.
on your input. Sometimes very simple ones work.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need complicated ones.
Yeah, so it's a lot of playing around and
It's
seeing
been
what
5
works.
years just testing, right? So how do you?
No, people do that.
They
Actually.
apply
They
Yeah.
spend
machine learning to
6
that
months,
problem and then-
1
Yeah,
year
there you go.
trying to figure it out.
Right. And, I mean, they just happen to be the ones who won, right? There are many others. Okay, so I'm going to sort of just show a few pictures and say what the punchline is. So to give you an idea of what's happening, this array here is images or patches of images that had high activation with some of the convolutional filters in the first layer of that network. So you can see that this one is like, it likes to see diagonal lines. This one likes to see vertical lines. This one likes to see green. But if you step over here, this is layer 2. Already, this filter, filter that's being represented up here, is highly activated if it sees a lot of vertical parallel lines. Not just single vertical edge, but a lot of vertical parallels. This one is activated if it sees something kind of curved. This one is activated mostly with yellow. Okay, that's fine. This one sees corners, it seems. So that's already in the second layer. That's what's highly activating these filters. And then you get some even deeper ideas. Like here, this filter is highly activated if it's seeing like some sort of geometric structure like that, like the diamond figures. There's some better pictures on the next one where, for example,
So these are the inputs to the start of the.
yes, it's asking of all the inputs that we have, what patches of images highly activate the filters that are in the various layers.
So the one on the right side is not the input to the layer 4. The input to the layer 4 is another activate.
Well, so this is the input to the whole network. So each of these pictures, and they're actually larger pictures, but then it's just selecting which patch of each picture is highly activating the filter that's represented here. So this filter really seems to like dogs. But we didn't see that in the first layer. We didn't see a dog filter. So it's really amazing that this is what the filters can actually see.
A composition of primitive features to increasingly sophisticated features.
That's exactly right. Yep, and that's the hierarchical nature that you can see hierarchical structures later in the network that you can't see early because we have these very small filters to start with. Okay, and then I think I'll sort of skip past this, but I can show you at some point. These are some images that are computer generated that maximally elicit activation from various filters. But you can see that as we go deeper into the layers, we get more complex patterns.
Why is that color here? I thought the activations are.
This is an input image that maximally activates something later. So it's an actual input image.
These are like
And so it has-
adversarial inputs.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Okay, and so this is basically the last slide, the punchline. Then I just have pictures. So what do we want to do? Find an image X. It should be close in content to the image C and close in style to the image P. How do we do that? We minimize how far off X is from C in content and how far off X is from P in style. Well, what are those? I'll just put some multipliers next to here because you can weight how far, if you really want to reflect style, you can weight this more highly, so you want to minimize that more strongly. So what is the content loss? Well, in each layer, you get a bunch of activations, and as you saw in the previous pictures, those activations seem to be reflecting content, right? One of the filters was highly activated in the 6th layer when it saw dogs. So it is highly activated by dogs, so it is a dog filter. So how do we tell if the content of these two images is far off? Well, we just take the difference of the output of those outputs, and we again measure Euclidean distance. And we do that over each layer. So deep in the network, you're saying I want to make sure that if there's a dog in the original image, there's a dog in the new image. But early on, it's really like base level figures. Are there vertical edges? And then you can weight. I don't need to get into that. You're just summing over. And then what about style loss? Well, we talked about style, right? It's the gram matrix. But now we have a bunch of gram matrices, one for each layer, right? It's how do these various filters interplay with each other? But we can ask that for each layer. Is it true that every dog I see happens to also be a blue dog, right? And so you can see how far away the gram matrices are for each of the layers and measure that distance and take a sum. And you can apply some weighting here. These are some parameters that you can choose based on how deep in the style you want to look. Okay, so how do you solve an optimization problem? You initialize X at random, and then you use gradient descent. Okay? Repeat, and then eventually you decrease this quantity to as small a value as possible.
So the Van Gogh Doge starts as just random noise?
Yeah, so there are different initialization ideas. Sometimes people just take the initial, they take X to be Doge itself, right? But based on where you start, it very well could change where you end up because you actually get to local minima with gradient descent algorithms, and so you could have a lot of different based on how you initialize. So that's the whole story. That's what this algorithm does. And just to leave you with some pictures, there's a group that has been able to seamlessly paste in images into others. So Captain America's shield has been seamlessly put into this Roman image. Photo style, which is a little bit harder because you have to maintain strict structure. So take this picture of a cabin, stylize it like this really cool filtered image, and that's the result. It has taken all of the trees and made them nice and white and pop. It has put a lot of clouds in. What about sort of preserving semantics? This algorithm that I've shown you so far would take this style image and this content image and just do this to it because it thinks everything is kind of bluish. But actually, water is different than sky in this picture, and so what we should do is just stylize the water kind of separately from the sky. And so there's an algorithm, there's an extension of this that can do that. So I think it's all very beautiful, and I hope you do too. Thanks very much.